to look this way. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ruben Azizia nahu, nau mai haere mai ki te whare tawahi amahi I Aotearoa. Greetings to all. My name is Ruben Azizian. I don't have to read it. Welcome everybody to the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. I'm the co-chair of the Auckland branch of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. If you haven't heard about the Institute or the branch, that's entirely our fault. Executive Director Hamesh Dougal is here, and we would like you to, consider, being part of our activities. As you know, tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to welcome a very senior member of NATO organization, Dr. Bennedetta Berti, so who will be properly introduced. But before I do that, I would like to thank, and I already thanked some, and I even hugged some of the organizers of this event. So there are several. So it's Auckland branch and a national branch of the NZIA, but also very much the Netherlands Embassy and the ambassadors here. Netherlands Embassy is also representing NATO in a public diplomacy sense. I will also like to thank the Auckland branch of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which I have openly said is the best part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of New Zealand. And Rachel is here, director. So thank you very much for this opportunity and this great venue. Also, the Center for Defense and Security Studies of Massey University. That's where I also work sometimes. So the center was instrumental in, along with the Embassy of Netherlands, to bringing Dr. Berti to this event. We have a conference in the next few days, so that's what I like to say. Hamish, I didn't forget anyone to thank or hug. Okay. Now we have a certain protocol here. So first, I'd like to introduce the Ambassador of Netherlands, because, as I said, the embassy has been very helpful. Jason and Laura are here. You've seen some people who look nice, but also very busy. There's Jason and Laura. Thank you very much for helping us out. So, Ambassador, been 8 months in New Zealand. Yes. He is not only looking after New Zealand relations, he is also South Pacific ambassador, looking after relations with Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Cook Islands. So I told the ambassador that I hope he has a good deputy, because for him to, travel around, it's a joy. Yes. And take your time. Take your time. Yes. Ambassador has had a very extensive and rich diplomatic career. He served in the United States as a consul general for Southeast Asia. He served in San Francisco, in Albania, in Tirana. Yes, right? There was such a contrast. And also in The Hague, and which of course we hear a lot, and also in the context of Ukraine. Some of us are looking forward to some future trials, hopefully, but that's for Dr. Berti to comment on that. Okay. Welcome, Ambassador, and if you'd like to say a few words, yes, that would be great. Thank you.
I will just use the lectern if that's okay to you. Yes. And let me see if this works. Otherwise, I use your mic. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Kia ora koutou, nā mai hao mai. So, as you said, thank you for the introduction, and I'm 8 months in and the Dutch ambassador. So also the first thing I always ask, are there any Dutch in the room? Any Dutchies? Because we have about 150,000 of them in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is really amazing, but that's not why I'm here tonight. So first of all, thank you, and I keep you the paper, Laura. Let's introduce Laura and Jason, actually, who put this event together. Laura, you're there. Jason, you're over there. Thank you so much. But also, I would like to recognize the colleagues in the room. There is the Dutch consul in Auckland. So great that you're looking after the Dutch here in Auckland and this region. And there's also the Polish, I think, consul is here as well. And probably others. So thank you for all your work that you do. But everyone here, it's great that you are here and interested in this conversation. about tonight's theme is why Ukraine matters. This evening would not have come together without your assistant, Hamish. Thank you so much for putting it together with Ruben. Thank you, and I really look forward to it, to hear more about what's happening and why NATO is a relevant partner also to New Zealand. So once again, why am I here behind this lecture? For you to know that in every NATO partner country like New Zealand, a NATO member, embassy serves as a contact point. So for me, it's now 2 years we are in as a contact point embassy in Wellington, but now another 2 years coming up. We facilitate as a platform to disseminate information, but also just be an open contact point if you have questions about NATO, or also starting an engagement or conversation about it. So if you have any questions about tonight or in the future, or you're looking for collaboration, please contact Laura and Jason, myself, to see what we can do and also to see how that relationship works. So I think it's quite interesting also why we talk about NATO, because I also represent a country that suffered from occupation, like many did on the European continent. We do understand the need for a closer coordination on security efforts, because, and in fact, that's also what we say, we are stronger together. And don't underestimate New Zealand and Europe as such in that relationship, because as you know, they have a historic relationship, especially, you know, when we think back to World War I and World War II. And now, again, with the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, is again that the Netherlands, the European Union and the NATO members are very grateful for the support of New Zealand, and it is continuing that support. We also know that there are no quick wins in this space, so it's important to maintain our resolve for the coming year and maybe the years to come. This war also once again shows that this topic is very relevant, not only for New Zealand or the Ukraine, but also for the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's really interesting to have Dr. Berti here tonight, because you are a very important factor in what we do. Maybe people would say, oh, being in the policy planning unit, what does that make? Well, today we were actually in an office where they said, oh, we expected you to be 100 years old. Because I hope you looked up her resume, because she has written so many articles. You joined NATO in 2017, if I'm correct? Yes, I'm correct on that. And you've written before, and also during that period, a lot of books about, especially on counterterrorism, but also about security issues and security challenges. So we're not having like 4 hours to talk about all this topic, but let's focus tonight about the impact and the consequences of the Russian war for New Zealand and the Indo-Pacific region. I think it's quite relevant, and it's also quite relevant, as we had last night, we had a conversation in Wellington to think about your questions prior, because at the end of the day, it's about the conversation. So if you already have questions and so on, or not, but it is about the conversation. So think about it, you will be invited, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So, with not further ado, that's your cue.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, you have all.
I have some very.
So thank you so much, and stay connected.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and to everyone for being here this evening, and also to the organizers of this important conversation that we're going to have over the next hour or so. I'm going to keep strictly to my instructions and start with a roughly 20 plus minus remarks, and then really looking forward to your question and comments, and to engage in a conversation, not just about the topics of this lecture, but about really everything that might be on your mind with respect to European security and NATO. Worst case scenario, you ask me something I don't know, and then I'll just say I don't know, which can also happen. It might. So with that, let me just start. The topic that I was asked to address is, I think, one of the most important ones, at least where I sit in Brussels. But I think I'm going to make the point that it's not just about European security. It's not just about Ukraine's right to self-defense. It is really about the rules-based international order and ultimately what type of world we want to live in. So I'm going to make the case that what is happening today in Europe.
Doctor, we can't hear you.
Oh, no, it doesn't work. Interesting.
Is it green?
It's green.
Oh,
It's not-
maybe closer somewhere.
I think, or
Or you put
closer,
it closer.
either I hold it like
yeah, there you go,
this.
yeah.
You will have to do it
Better,
yourself, though.
Well, then how about I use the old
Are you
fashioned?
okay? Okay, sorry about that.
No, of course, no problem.
Right.
Better?
Yeah.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Well, you didn't miss much. I was just starting. Erase and rewind. I was saying for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to make a few remarks about why Ukraine matters to NATO, to European security, to the rules-based international order, and talk a little bit about what I see as security and geopolitical connections between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. And then hopefully we can have a conversation around that. To start, I think it's very important when we talk about wars and when we talk about the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, before we go into the geopolitical analysis, which is what we're here for, I think it's important to start with a few facts. It's over a year since the Russian Federation and Putin started this unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. But of course, even though February 2022 is a watershed moment in terms of European and global security, we must remember that for Ukraine, the war started prior. It started in 2014 with the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea. So that has been years through which Ukraine has had to endure aggression through various forms. So just to say that, yes, it's 1 year of fully fledged war in the European continent, but really we have to look at the post-2014 pattern of increasingly aggressive behavior, illegal annexation, and war in eastern Ukraine. So just to put it in context. So where are we? Over a year into this conflict. I think anybody who claims to know exactly how this conflict will end is probably a little bit overconfident, because wars have a life cycle of their own. They don't call it the fog of war for nothing. But 1 year in, there's a few things that we do know, I think. We do know that at the very beginning, we had underestimated the Ukrainian resolve. We had underestimated their will to fight, their ability to fight, their determination as a society to come together to resist aggression. And I think that's important to recognize. We had probably overestimated the Russian military capabilities, their morale, their resolve, and that's also important to recognize. That said, where we are today is in a situation in which Ukraine, through their ingenuity, through bravery, through skill set in the battlefield, has been able to push back against the Russian aggression, has been able to retake and liberate territory, and that's good news, of course. But none of that should make us confident or complacent that this is a done deal. We are right now in a war of attrition. It's over a year in. It's a battle of logistics, a battle of wills, and very much the situation on the battlefield doesn't indicate any short-term or quick, unfortunately, resolution of the conflict, which I think it's an important point we need to make when we think about what ultimately is our policy objective for Ukraine to be able to prevail as a sovereign, independent country. In other words, our support has been important so far, but the war is not over, and that's why we talk so much about the importance of supporting Ukraine for the long haul. So that's point one. That's where we are in a very brief nutshell into over 1 year of this war of aggression. Before we talk about how this war has changed European security, which I think it has, and how it's changed the way NATO is looking at itself and the importance of collective defense, which I also think it has, I think it's important that we recognize that the most important and direct impact of Russia's war against Ukraine is, of course, on Ukraine. And the biggest price is being paid by ordinary Ukrainians, by civilians. The number of internally displaced persons, refugees, the number of documented atrocities, Russia's deliberate strategy of war, which is about targeting civilians and civilians' infrastructure to undermine their will, to undermine the will as a nation to fight. All of that is the most important, I think, element to recognize when we talk about this war. Ultimately, it's about the effect it has on people, on civilians, and on a free country's ability to prosper and to exist finally. So it's important, I think, that we think about the human security of the conflict before we go into the geopolitics. That said, it also has serious, I think, dramatic consequences on the geopolitical context. And of course, before we get to the geopolitical and global, I would say, on European security. We talk about Russia's war against Ukraine as the gravest security crisis in Europe since World War II. I definitely stand by that assessment. I also think that for us, and here I'm thinking about the NATO alliance and NATO allies, when the war started, it wasn't just peace in Europe that was shattered, but it was also a lot of our assumptions about the security environment. In a sense, just to give you a vignette into what I'm talking about, NATO, a few months after Russia began its war of aggression, adopted a new strategic concept, which is basically the one-stop shop document that the allies agree every 10 years or so to define the security environment. And the prior exercise that occurred in 2010. And if you compare the two texts, the contrast couldn't be starker. In 2010, we talked about Europe being at peace. We talked about the risk of conventional conflict being low. We talked about threats and challenges as being something that would come from outside of Europe, from outside the Euro-Atlantic area, asymmetric, unconventional. We talked about the importance to do crisis management and to really think about how to prevent and counter crises that would arise outside of Europe. Of course, all of that remains important. But the reality is that in 2022, Europe is no longer at peace. The Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. The risk of conventional war cannot be discounted. And a lot of the assumptions that we had about the European security environment, which basically were it's about stability, it's about cooperation, it's about the post-Cold War peace dividend, where we have shared rules and norms. All of that we simply cannot take for granted. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of this strategic shift from our perspective. It's really about rebuilding our ability to do deterrence and defense, re-emphasizing the importance of territorial defense of Europe. A lot of conversations that in a way we hadn't had for decades. Of course, that was not solely because of Russia's war of aggression, but it certainly exacerbated an already deteriorating security environment. So for us, it's really, I would say, a quite dramatic shift. Of course, it's not just about, and that's where I want to make a link between what is happening in terms of undermining and destabilizing the European security order and the broader global security architecture. And to me, the most obvious interlinkage is between what is happening right now in Ukraine and the impact on the broader rules-based international order. What we have, very simply, we can talk about it more, but it's about one country violating basically basic principles of international law, flaunting its obligation under the US Charter, violating basic principles that have really regulated and enabled us to cooperate as an international community, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, the respect of each and every country to make their own free foreign policy choices, to choose their own alliances, to be a free and independent country, essentially. And that's what Russia is doing against Ukraine. And on top of that, we also see a way of waging war, which defies and violates international humanitarian law systematically. So when you put it all together, of course, this, in my view, does undermine the rules-based international order. And that's something that I think brings us back to why this matters here in New Zealand and why this matters in all like-minded countries that do place a great importance on being an international community that abides by common rules and principles. That's what has enabled us to cooperate, and that's what has enabled peace and security. And of course, the fact that you have a major power essentially flaunting its obligations and seeking to apply what I would call a revisionist strategy that wants to bring back a world of spheres of influence, a world where the strongest dictates the term, where might makes right, and where through just the sheer use of force, one can intimidate its neighbors and try to coerce their foreign policy choices. That's clearly not just a European problem. That's not a world I think we want to live in. As free sovereign countries and as countries that are based on democratic principles and believe in the rules-based international order. So to me, that's probably, and interested of course in your assessment, one of the key reasons why what matters in Ukraine, even though it's geographically quite far away, has an impact that is far beyond. It really is about global security. Moreover, I would also say, and that's something that we are assessing at the moment of NATO, we feel, not surprisingly, that the security environment is more and more shaped by growing strategic competition. And in the context of the growing strategic competition, we see how assertive authoritarian powers are leading a pushback against the rules-based international order. And here, of course, we're not just looking at Russia. So we're thinking about what is the impact of what is happening in Ukraine on the broader rules-based international order. What type of signals does this send to other potential systemic challengers? And of course, I'm thinking China here. What is the message to Beijing if Putin is able to get away with naked aggression, if there is no price to pay for aggression, if there is a reward? What is the message, and what does that mean for the Indo-Pacific region, and most broadly, what does this mean for the global balance of power in an age of heightened strategic competition? So to me, that's another important link that we're assessing, in which we're bringing, again, what happens there very much closer to what is happening here in the Indo-Pacific region at large. Then, of course, when we talk about the consequences of the war of aggression and its global impact, we also, I think, could talk about the price of the weaponization of food supply, the weaponization of energy. And that's, first of all, that is already a very serious precedent that we may expect, again, other authoritarians, but competitors and challenges to use against us. But also we see how the most direct impact of these tactics are on the countries that are already vulnerable, that are already fragile, that are already suffering from a series of other problems. So these are compounded by the deliberate weaponization of energy and food that we see implemented, I think, systematically by the Russian Federation. So basically, long story short, what matters, this is not what happens in Europe, I think matters here, and matters to the Indo-Pacific, but, and that's why it's so important to support Ukraine. And that's why when we talk about like-minded countries standing together, by providing humanitarian, financial, and military assistance to Ukraine, we're not talking just about a regional issue or a Ukraine issue or a European issue, but we're talking really about a global rules-based international order issue. And I just thought I said it because I'm seeing like people very bravely putting a really brave face and being very polite and listening to me while they pass out, which is not where we wanted to go. So sorry for that. We won't let that happen. So I thought I'd say something because what matters in this room also matters. So sorry. Let's go back to my, yes, I see fans. And so going back to.
It's a topic which makes sense.
It's also the topic, but I think already the room opening the doors, it's really helping us to collectively collect ourselves. Yeah. So that was the parenthesis closed. There's nothing humorous about this topic, of course. I'm just making a completely impromptu observation based on the climate in the room. But now going back to the lecture, I think to not to conclude, because this is just meant to be a conversation starter, I think that the other side of the conversation that we need to have is just as me coming here and talking about why Europe matters, why European security and more specifically Russia's war against Ukraine matters for the Indo-Pacific. I think from where I sit in Brussels and where we sit as Europeans is more and more important that we also think about how security developments in this part of the world and security developments in Asia-Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific actually also matter to European security. So in other words, the interconnections, political, geopolitical, economic, security-wise goes both ways. And that's also why I'm here also to learn about how these interconnections play out. And of course, that's obvious for many reasons. The most basic one, I would say, there's so many shared security threats and challenges that we face that have absolutely nothing to do with geography. They're not bound by borders. Let's think of hybrid threats, cyber threats, but I think most importantly, let's think about the existential challenge of climate change. That's one common challenge that we have, in which really the geography of where we sit in the world doesn't particularly affect the outcome. And that's one of the reasons why for us as NATO, working on climate change and security is really our priority. We're deliberately reaching out beyond our neighborhood, beyond the Euro-Atlantic region, towards our southern neighborhoods, Middle East and North Africa, but also more towards our global partners, including in this part of the world. So that's one common area, one common challenge, one common threat, I would say, that we face, in which the security link is absolutely crystal clear. Another common challenge, I would say, is the one I already alluded to, the fact that we do live in a time of heightened strategic competitions, with heightened challenges to the rules-based international order, and where we see more and more those interconnections that for many years we had thought would bring us closest together, which they still do in some cases, but in many other cases, they also can be weaponized or utilized against us. And so that's also something that I think brings us together, for example, in the reflection on how to think about resilience, how to think about mitigating strategic vulnerabilities, how to think about energy, supply chain security, how to think about mitigating one-sided or strategic vulnerabilities from strategic competitors. And of course, as Europe, we have learned a thing or two about that over the last year, as Russia has weaponized our dependency on their oil and gas. And as a response, we have, I think, rapidly decoupled from that dependency. But of course, many could say, and I would personally, not as an official, but personally agree that we could have done much earlier, we could have done so much earlier. But of course, we're also trying to learn, how do we not repeat that mistake? How do we not switch from one dependency on an authoritarian, assertive, potential competitor to another? And I think that's another conversation that could bring us together, while respecting that different countries will make different choices when balancing between economics, geopolitics, security, and that's of course their sovereign right. But I think there's still a conversation to be had. And finally, very obvious, but I think it's important to remember to acknowledge, just the security crisis in Europe are affecting global security. Potential security crisis in this area of the world would also have a profound impact on global security and on Europe specifically. Think about a Taiwan contingency, or think about other flashpoints in the region. They would disrupt global trade, they will disrupt global supply chains, they will disrupt global security, anything that would undermine freedom of navigation, maritime stability in the maritime domain, free, open, Indo-Pacific. All of this would also affect European security one way or another. And then we can talk about what does that mean in terms of engagement. Of course, NATO is a regional organization representing European and North American allies. So the point is not to change its nature or to deploy military elsewhere. But the point is, how do we account for the fact that what happens outside of Europe does affect our security, and how do we cooperate with like-minded countries to tackle shared challenges? And that's very much, I think, where I'll end, because I'm out of time, and we'll hopefully start a conversation. Thank you. Surviving the heat.